He drove the last iron nail into the threshold, the hammer's crack echoing off the canyon walls. It took 2 years to pull this cabin from the mountain. He built it for a woman he'd never met. Most men sent for a bride offering only a canvas tent or a drafty shack. Gideon offered timber that wouldn't yield to winter. When the stagecoach brought her, he expected tears of regret. Instead, she dropped her bags, touched the rough-hewn door frame, and claimed it. The draw knife sheared a long, curling ribbon of pale wood from the lodgepole pine, the sharp scent of raw sap cutting through the crisp autumn air. Gideon Reed paused, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of a canvas-gloved hand. His muscles burned. A deep, familiar ache settled into his lower back, the kind of ache that came from swinging an axe and hauling dead weight from dawn until the sun slipped behind the jagged teeth of the Colorado Rockies. He kicked the shaving aside. It joined a massive pile of wood chips and sawdust that carpeted the clearing. Before him stood the skeleton of a cabin. Not a shanty, not a temporary claim shack meant to blow over in a heavy gale. A home. Gideon was 38 years old. He had spent the last 15 of those years wandering the high country, trapping beaver, panning out meager flakes of gold, and sleeping beneath canvas or the open sky. He knew the bite of frost on a wool blanket. He knew the terrifying hollow silence of a snowed-in winter, where a man could go weeks without hearing a human voice. The mountain was a jealous companion. It took everything and offered nothing but scenery and survival. He was tired of merely surviving. He hoisted the peeled log onto his shoulder, his boots sinking into the damp earth as he walked it over to the foundation. He had chosen this spot carefully. A south-facing slope to catch the winter sun, backed against a dense stand of spruce, to break the north wind with a clear creek running less than 50 yards away. He set the log down and reached for his broadaxe to notch the end. Hack. Chop. The rhythmic sound echoed across the empty valley. Gideon didn't harbor any romantic delusions about the frontier. The men who came out west looking for adventure usually ended up buried under a pile of loose rocks within a year. The ones who survived were the ones who respected the brutal math of the wilderness. Calories burned versus calories consumed. Firewood cut versus the length of the freeze. And then there was the math of isolation. A man could only talk to his mules for so long before his mind started to fray at the edges. He needed a wife. He fit the log into the saddle notch of the one beneath it. It locked perfectly into place. Tight. Solid. No gaps for the wind to whistle through. He drove a wooden peg through the joint securing it. The idea of sending away for a woman felt transactional, bordering on cold, but the West was built on cold transactions. The local town of Bitter Creek, a full day's ride down the mountain, had a population of 300 miners, loggers, and drifters. There were 5 women in town, and none of them were looking to move up to the timberline to gut elk and haul water. So he had built the house first. Most men sent the letter, paid the fare, and let the poor woman arrive to a dirt floor and a leaky roof. Gideon refused to be that kind of man. If he was going to ask a woman to leave whatever miserable life she was escaping in the East, he owed her walls that wouldn't let the weather in. By the time the first snow dusted the peaks, the roof was on. Cedar shakes split by his own hand, overlapping thick and heavy. He spent November hauling river stones up from the creek bed, mixing mortar from clay and dried grass, building a massive hearth that anchored the center of the main room. He laid a proper floor of planed boards, sweeping out the sawdust. He built a heavy oak table, 2 sturdy chairs, and a bed frame thick enough to withstand a rock slide. When it was finished, he stood in the center of the room. The air was cold, but still. The wind howled outside, but the walls didn't shudder. That night, he lit a kerosene lantern, dipped a steel pen into a bottle of ink that he had to thaw by the fire, and wrote the letter. He didn't waste ink on poetry. To the matrimonial agency of St. Louis. My name is Gideon Reed. I am 38. I am a mountainman, a trapper, and a builder. I claim no great wealth, but I hold a deed to land in the high country, and I have built a solid house. I do not drink to excess, and I do not strike women or animals. I am looking for a wife. I need a woman who understands hard work. The winters here are long and the quiet is deep. I offer a warm fire meat in the smokehouse and my loyalty. Send someone who is not afraid of the dark. Enclosed is the bank draft for the train fare. He signed it, folded it, and sealed it with wax. He looked around the empty, silent cabin. The fire cast long, dancing shadows against the fresh timber. It felt too big now, too quiet. He rode down to Bitter Creek the next morning and handed the letter to the postmaster. Then the waiting began. The stagecoach hit a rut violently, throwing Clara Bennett against the unyielding wooden wall of the carriage. Her teeth clamped shut, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from crying out. She tasted a faint copper tang, but simply swallowed, adjusted her faded wool shawl, and stared straight ahead. The man sitting across from her, a travelling dry goods salesman sweating through a cheap suit, shot her a look of mild irritation, as if she had deliberately orchestrated the bump to inconvenience him. Clara ignored him. She was 32 years old, a widow of 5 years, and long past the point of caring about the bruised sensibilities of strangers. Dust filtered through the gaps in the floorboards, coating her dark dress in a fine, chalky film. She rubbed her thumb over the worn clasp of her leather reticule. Inside sat the crumpled letter from Gideon Reed, a piece of paper she had read so many times she had memorized the rigid, angular loops of his handwriting. Send someone who is not afraid of the dark. That single sentence was why she had chosen him. The agency in St. Louis had offered her files on merchants, blacksmiths, and lonely farmers across the plains. Most of them wanted a pretty young thing to mend their socks and bear them a dozen children. They wrote flowery letters full of false promises about the bounty of the West. Gideon Reed had promised nothing but a warm fire meat and his loyalty. He hadn't asked for a delicate flower, he had asked for endurance. Clara had endurance in spades. She had endured a loveless marriage to a man who drank his wages and died leaving her with a mountain of debt. She had endured 5 years of scrubbing the floors of wealthy St. Louis matrons, her hands submerged in lye water until the skin cracked and bled, just to keep a roof over her head in a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. She was done being cold in a city full of people. If she was going to be cold, she would rather do it on a mountain on her own terms, with a man who at least had the decency to be blunt about it. "Next stop, Bitter Creek," the driver yelled from above his voice, muffled by the pounding hooves and grinding wheels. The stagecoach began to slow the brakes, squealing in protest. Clara sat up straighter, smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt with rough, calloused hands. She checked her reflection in the small window glass. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, practical bun, dusted with trail dirt. Her face was pale, tired, the lines around her mouth etched a little deeper by the grueling 2-week journey. She didn't look like a blushing bride. She looked like a survivor. The coach lurched to a halt. Clara grabbed her single battered valise and stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun. Bitter Creek was less a town and more a scar carved into the dirt. A single muddy street lined with false-fronted wooden buildings, a saloon, a mercantile, a boarding house, and an assayer's office. Men in mud-caked boots and heavy coats stopped on the boardwalks to stare at the stagecoach, their eyes hungry and assessing. Clara stood by the wheel, refusing to shrink under their gaze. "You, Clara!" The voice came from behind her. It was a deep baritone, like rocks grinding together in a riverbed. She turned. The man standing there was large. Not fat, but dense, built like a wall of cordwood. He wore canvas trousers, a heavy wool coat, and a battered felt hat. His beard was thick, dark brown, threaded with iron grey, framing a face tanned to the texture of saddle leather. His eyes a pale, startling grey locked onto hers. They weren't unkind eyes, but they were guarded, calculating. "I am Clara Bennett." She said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "You are Gideon Reed." "I am." He didn't offer a smile. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply looked her up and down, noting the fraying edges of her coat and the sturdy, unglamorous boots on her feet. He seemed to approve of the boots. "You brought a trunk. Just this," she said, hefting the valise. Gideon's eyebrows twitched upward a fraction of an inch. Most mail-order brides brought half a house with them. The fact that she carried her entire life in one bag told him more about her than 100 letters could. He reached out and took the bag from her grip. His hands were massive, the knuckles scarred. "Wagon's over here. We have a long ride up. We need to leave before the sun drops." He led her to a flatbed wagon, hitched to a pair of shaggy, strong-looking draft horses. The back of the wagon was loaded with burlap sacks of flour tins of coffee-salt pork and boxes of nails. Supplies for the winter. Gideon tossed her bag in the back and held out a hand to help her up onto the high wooden bench. She hesitated for a second, then placed her small, rough hand in his. His grip was firm, lifting her effortlessly. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. The horses lurched forward, pulling them away from the noisy, staring town. They rode in silence for the first mile. The town faded, quickly replaced by the towering, silent pines. The road was barely a trail, winding steeply upward into the mountains. The air immediately grew colder, biting at Clara's cheeks. "It's a steep grade," Gideon said, not looking at her, keeping his eyes on the horses. "Takes about 3 hours. It'll be dark when we get there." "I don't mind the dark," Clara said. Gideon glanced at her. He reached behind the seat, grabbed a thick woven wool blanket and dropped it across her lap. "Wrap up. The wind cuts through the pass." Clara pulled the blanket tightly around her shoulders. It smelled like wood smoke and horse sweat. To her surprise, it was the best thing she had smelled in years. The sun vanished behind the peaks, instantly plunging the world into a bruised, purple twilight. The temperature plummeted. Clara huddled under the heavy wool blanket, the jolting of the wagon jarring her tired bones. The trees pressed in close on either side of the trail, massive shadows stretching out like reaching fingers. The silence up here was absolute. Back in St. Louis, the night was always filled with the clatter of carriages, the shouting of drunks, the distant whistles of riverboats. Here there was only the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic, labored breathing of the draft horses. Clara realized how incredibly small she was. If this man wanted to murder her and leave her in the woods, no one would ever know. The thought flickered through her mind, cynical and sharp, but she dismissed it just as quickly. A man intending murder wouldn't have offered his only blanket. "Almost there," Gideon rumbled. It was the first thing he had said in an hour. The wagon crested a steep ridge, and the dense wall of pines suddenly broke, revealing a wide, flat clearing. At the far end, backed against a sheer rock face, and a stand of ancient spruce, stood the cabin. Gideon pulled back on the reins. "Whoa!" The horses stopped, steam rising from their flanks in the frigid air. Gideon didn't move to get down. He sat on the bench, staring at the structure he had built, his hands tight on the leather straps. This was the moment of truth. He had seen men bring wives to the high country. He had seen the women step off wagons, look at the isolation, the raw, unpainted wood, the sheer brutality of the wilderness, and burst into tears. He braced himself for it. The weeping, the recriminations, the panicked realization of what she had agreed to. Clara didn't cry. She pushed the blanket off her lap and stared. The moonlight cut through the clearing, illuminating the cabin. It wasn't a shack. It was large, rectangular, built from massive logs stripped of their bark and perfectly notched. The joints were tight, chinked smoothly with pale mortar. A heavy stone chimney rose from the center of the shake roof. Across the front, running the length of the house, was a covered porch. A porch. Clara stared at it. A man who only cared about survival built a square box with a door. A man who built a porch was a man who intended to sit on it. A man who intended to stay. "You built this," she said softly. It wasn't a question. "I did," Gideon said, his voice tight. "Felled the timber, hauled the stone. It ain't painted, ain't got glass in the windows yet, just oiled paper and heavy shutters. But the roof don't leak, and the wind don't get in." He waited for her to point out the lack of neighbors, the distance to the nearest doctor, the sheer, overwhelming darkness of the trees. Clara stood up on the footboard. She didn't wait for him to help her down. She grabbed the side of the wagon and swung herself to the hard, packed earth. Her boots crunched on the frost. She walked toward the cabin, her eyes scanning the solid walls, the stacked cords of firewood, neatly arranged under the eaves, the rain barrel positioned perfectly by the corner. Everything had a place. Everything was intentional. She stepped up onto the porch. The floorboards didn't groan beneath her weight. She reached out and ran a hand over the heavy, rough-hewn oak of the front door frame. It was solid, unmovable. After years of living in rented rooms, of walking on floors that belonged to other people, the sheer permanence of the wood sent a strange ache through her chest. Gideon walked up behind her, carrying her valise in one hand and a lantern in the other. He reached past her and pushed the heavy door open. It swung smoothly on forged iron hinges. He struck a match, lit the lantern, and stepped inside, holding the light high so she could see. Clara crossed the threshold. The air inside was freezing, holding the deep chill of an unlit house, but it smelled incredibly clean. Pine sap, dried clay, and the faint, dusty scent of raw iron. The lantern light flickered over the interior. The floor was smooth wood, freshly swept. In the center of the room sat a massive fieldstone hearth, the stones fitted together with careful precision. To the right was a heavy table and chairs. To the left, a cast-iron cook stove gleaming black in the dim light. In the far corner, a bed frame piled high with folded quilts. There were no curtains. There were no rugs. There was nothing soft in the room except the quilts. It was austere, practical, and relentlessly masculine. And it was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever seen. She walked slowly to the center of the room, stopping in front of the cold hearth. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the cold stone of the mantelpiece. It didn't shift. It didn't wobble. It was anchored to the earth. Gideon watched her from the doorway, his chest tight. He watched her run her hands over the stone, watched her look at the heavy table, watched her take in the empty freezing room. Clara turned around to face him. She unpinned her hat, pulling it from her head, letting the trail dust fall to the clean floor. "It's a good house, Mr. Reed," Clara said, her voice dropping the formal, guarded tone she had used in town. It sounded softer now, relieved. Gideon let out a slow, quiet breath, feeling a knot in his chest, loosen a knot he hadn't fully realized was there. He set her valise down by the bed and walked over to the hearth. "It's freezing," he said gruffly, hiding his relief behind action. "Let's get a fire going." He knelt by the hearth, pulling kindling and dry logs from a basket. Clara didn't stand by and watch. She immediately walked over to the cast-iron stove, located the water bucket sitting beside it, and found the tin coffee pot hanging from a hook. "Where do you keep the coffee grinds?" she asked, rolling up the sleeves of her faded dress. Gideon struck a match and held it to the kindling. The yellow flame flared, catching the dry wood instantly. He looked back over his shoulder. Clara was already inspecting the stove flues, moving with the quiet, efficient competence of a woman who knew how to work. "Top shelf of the larder, left side of the stove," he said. Within 10 minutes, a fire was roaring in the stone hearth, casting a fierce, warm glow across the wooden walls and pushing the bitter cold back into the corners. The smell of boiling coffee filled the cabin, mixing with the wood smoke. They sat at the heavy oak table, the lantern burning between them, wrapping their cold hands around tin mugs of black, scalding coffee. The silence between them wasn't the heavy, anxious silence of the wagon ride. It was the quiet of a closed door. Clara looked around the room once more, the firelight reflecting in her tired eyes. She looked at the solid walls, the roaring fire, and then at the large, quiet man sitting across from her. "It's a good house," she repeated softly, taking a sip of her coffee. "It feels like home." Gideon looked at her, noting the dirt on her cheek, the exhaustion in her posture, and the absolute lack of fear in her eyes. He nodded once. "It is now," he said. The cold did not creep into the cabin. It invaded. It seeped through the heavy wooden shutters and settled heavy on the floorboards, waiting to bite at bare feet. Gideon awoke before the sun. He lay still for a moment, listening. The wind had died down, leaving behind a silence so absolute it rang in his ears. He was on the floor, wrapped in a heavy buffalo hide near the hearth. He had surrendered the massive oak bed to Clara the night before, taking to the floorboards without a word of discussion. It was simply what had to be done. He pushed the hide aside. The fire had burned down to a pile of glowing orange embers coated in grey ash. The air in the room was sharp enough to make his lungs ache. He stood pulling his suspenders over his broad shoulders and glanced toward the bed in the corner. Clara was a lump under a mountain of quilts. She hadn't moved. Good. Let her sleep. The first morning in the high country was always a brutal reckoning. Gideon knelt by the hearth, blowing softly on the coals until they glowed cherry red, then fed them handfuls of dry cedar shavings. The flames caught, casting leaping shadows across the room. He moved to the cast-iron stove, loaded it with split birch, and struck a match. He expected to make the coffee himself. He expected to fry the salt pork and boil the beans just as he had done every morning for 15 years. A rustle of fabric stopped him. Clara pushed the heavy quilts back. She was fully dressed. She had slept in her high-collared wool dress, likely anticipating the freezing morning. She sat on the edge of the bed, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and reached for her boots. They were stiff with cold. She didn't groan. She didn't curse. She simply shoved her feet inside and began lacing them with quick, practiced, jerky movements. "You don't need to be up," Gideon said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "Sun ain't breached the ridge yet. Daylight burns whether we look at it or not," Clara replied. She smoothed her skirts and walked straight past him to the stove. She didn't look at the window to admire the snow. She didn't complain about the draft. She picked up the heavy iron skillet, wiping it down with a rag, and looked at the larder shelves. "Where is the bacon?" she asked. "Lower crock, left side." Gideon watched her. He had spent his life reading the woods, predicting the behavior of elk and mountain lions based on subtle shifts in the wind and broken twigs. He was trying to read the woman in his kitchen, but she was a closed book. She moved with a jagged efficiency, grab the knife, slice the meat, toss it in the pan. There was no hesitation. She didn't ask how the stove drafted or where the salt was kept. She figured it out by looking. "I have to see to the mules," Gideon said, grabbing his heavy wool coat and his rifle from the peg by the door. "Barnaby and Dutch. They get restless if I don't break the ice in their trough early." "I'll have breakfast ready when you get back," Clara said. She didn't turn around. She was already mixing flour and water in a tin bowl. Gideon stepped out into the crushing cold. The world was cast in a bruised pre-dawn blue. The snow crunched loudly under his boots. He walked to the sturdy lean-to he had built for the mules, his mind churning. He fed the animals, broke the ice in their barrel with the blunt end of his axe, and pitched fresh hay. The physical labor warmed his blood, but his thoughts remained fixed on the cabin. He had expected a period of breaking in. He had expected to teach a city woman how to survive. He hadn't expected a woman who treated survival like a daily chore she had already mastered. When he returned to the cabin 30 minutes later, the smell hit him before he even opened the door. Hot grease, strong coffee, wood smoke. He kicked the snow off his boots and stepped inside. The room was significantly warmer. The table was set with 2 tin plates. Thick slabs of bacon sizzled on a platter alongside a pile of heavy, flat pan biscuits. Clara was standing by the hearth holding a pair of his thick wool socks. She was inspecting the heels. "These are worn through," she said, looking up. "You walk on the outsides of your feet. It grinds the wool down. I found a basket of yarn by the window. I'll darn them today." Gideon hung his coat up. "You don't have to do that." "I am your wife," Clara said. The words hung in the air, blunt and unvarnished. "You built the house. You bought the food. You chop the wood. I will mend the socks and cook the meals. That is the arrangement, is it not?" Gideon looked at her. Her face was pale, devoid of makeup or artifice. Her hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful. She wasn't seeking affection. She was establishing a perimeter. She was making herself useful so she couldn't be discarded. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of a trapped animal realizing the cage door was open, but still expecting the trap to snap shut. "Sit down, Clara," he said softly. He walked to the table and pulled out a chair. He waited until she sat, then took the seat across from her. He reached out and took a biscuit, breaking it in half. "The arrangement," Gideon said, his voice slow and deliberate, "was that we share the work. I didn't buy a servant. I sent for a partner. If you want to mend my socks, I'm grateful, but you don't have to earn your right to sit by that fire. You're here. You stay." Clara stared at her plate. Her jaw tightened. For a second, Gideon thought she might cry. But the moment passed. She picked up her fork, speared a piece of bacon, and took a bite. "The coffee is bitter," she said. "I boil the grounds twice," Gideon replied, taking a sip from his mug. "Saves money." "We will boil them once," Clara said, looking him dead in the eye. "I draw the line at drinking mud." A slow, unexpected smile cracked the rigid lines of Gideon's bearded face. It felt strange on his muscles. "Once it is," he said. They ate the rest of their meal in silence. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of 2 strangers waiting for the other to strike. It was the rhythm of a machine settling into its gears. The rhythm held for 3 weeks. They fell into a routine dictated entirely by the sun and the cold. Gideon hauled wood, checked his trap lines in the lower valley, and hunted. Clara washed clothes in boiling water that stripped the skin from her knuckles, baked bread, and aggressively scrubbed the cabin floor with sand until the wood gleamed. They spoke little during the day. Words were a luxury. Action was a necessity. But in the evenings, when the wind howled around the eaves and the fire roared in the hearth, they sat by the light of the kerosene lantern. Gideon carved new handles for his tools. Clara mended clothes or knitted. They were learning each other's orbits. Gideon learned that Clara hummed a low, tuneless vibration in her throat when she was concentrating on a difficult knot. Clara learned that Gideon always cleaned his rifle before he ate, prioritizing the weapon that kept them alive over his own hunger. And then the sky turned the color of bruised iron. Gideon came back from the woodpile at midday carrying an armful of split oak. He dropped it into the iron cradle by the hearth and looked at Clara. "Fill every bucket we have," he said, "and the wash basins, everything that holds water." Clara wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron. A storm. The air tastes like copper, Gideon said, shedding his coat and grabbing his heavy iron spud bar. And the pressure dropped so fast my ears popped. It's going to be a bad one. I need to string a guide rope from the porch to the mule shed. Once the snow flies, we won't be able to see our hands in front of our faces. He was right. By 3 o'clock, the world disappeared. It didn't just snow. The sky collapsed. A wall of white fury slammed into the side of the cabin, making the heavy logs groan in protest. The wind shrieked, finding every tiny gap in the chinking, forcing fine, powdery snow through the cracks to settle like dust on the floorboards. Inside, the temperature dropped rapidly. Gideon piled 3 massive logs onto the fire, pushing the flames to a roaring crescendo. For the next 48 hours, they were trapped in a 20 by 20 wooden box. The storm removed the distractions of chores. There was no hunting. There was no scrubbing. There was only the fire, the howling wind, and each other. The first night of the blizzard, they sat at the table eating a stew Clara had made from dried elk meat and root vegetables. The lantern flickered as a particularly violent gust of wind slammed the roof. Clara looked up, her eyes lingering on the heavy cedar shakes above. "It'll hold," Gideon said, noticing her gaze. "I used 6-inch iron nails. The roof could take a fallen pine and not buckle." "I'm not afraid of it collapsing," Clara said quietly. She took a sip of water. "I'm just listening to the wind. In St. Louis, when the wind blew hard, it meant the river was rising. It meant the basement apartments flooded. It meant sickness." Gideon set his spoon down. It was the first time she had mentioned her life before the stagecoach. "You lived by the river?" he asked. "I lived wherever the rent was cheapest." She replied, her voice flat, devoid of self-pity. "My husband, before he died. He had a fondness for faro and rye whiskey. He left me with debts. The men who came to collect didn't care that I was a widow. They just wanted their coin." She stared into the lantern flame. "I spent 5 years cleaning up after people who owned fine things. I washed lace I wasn't allowed to touch without gloves. I scrubbed floors until my knees bled saving pennies in a tin can hidden under a loose floorboard. Every time I saved enough to leave something broke, a tooth, a boot, a winter coat." She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I read your letter. You said you offered meat in the smokehouse and walls that kept the weather out. You didn't lie." She gestured around the room. "The wind is screaming out there, and I am warm. For the first time in 10 years, Gideon, I am completely warm." It was the first time she had used his Christian name. It hit him harder than the wind hitting the roof. Gideon looked at this small, fierce woman. He saw the grey in her dark hair. He saw the hard lines of exhaustion etched around her mouth. He saw a survivor who had fought tooth and nail for a patch of dry ground. "I came up here to get away from the noise," Gideon said, slowly leaning his forearms on the heavy oak table. "I fought in the war, Shiloh, Antietam. I saw what men do to each other when they're crowded together in the mud." He rubbed a scarred hand over his beard. "After the war, I couldn't stand the sound of crowds, couldn't stand the shouting. So I kept walking west until the noise stopped. I built this place because up here, the only thing trying to kill you is the weather. And the weather is honest. It doesn't smile at you before it cuts your throat." He looked at her, his pale grey eyes intense. "But the quiet gets heavy, Clara. It gets so heavy it presses you into the floorboards. I thought I wanted to be alone. I was wrong." The wind raged outside, a chaotic frenzy of ice and violence. Inside, the heavy silence settled over them, not the silence of isolation, but the silence of understanding. Gideon stood up, walked around the table and stopped beside her chair. He didn't say anything. He just rested his massive, calloused hand on her shoulder. Clara went still. She didn't flinch away. After a long moment, she reached up and placed her rough, battered hand over his. The transaction was dead. They were just two people sheltering from the storm. The storm broke on the third morning, leaving behind a world buried under 3 feet of pristine, blinding white powder. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. The air was so cold it burned the nostrils and froze the moisture in the eyes. Gideon had to use his broad shoulder to force the heavy front door open, shoving against the snowdrift that had piled against the porch. "Stay inside," he ordered Clara, pulling his wool hat down over his ears and wrapping a scarf tightly around his lower face. "I have to dig out the shed. Barnaby and Dutch haven't had water in 2 days." Clara nodded already, throwing another log onto the fire to keep the cabin blazing hot for his return. Gideon grabbed his shovel and waded into the snow. It was exhausting work. Every step required lifting his leg waist high. He followed the guide rope he had strung blindly, shoveling his way toward the lean-to. When he finally reached the shed, he found the mules restless and stamping. The snow had drifted heavily against the back wall, but the roof had held. He pitched them a double ration of hay, then set to work on the frozen water trough. The ice was thick, frozen solid, nearly to the bottom. Gideon grabbed his heavy iron spud bar, a 6-foot length of solid iron with a chisel tip, and brought it down hard. Crack! The ice chipped but didn't break. He raised it higher, putting the muscles of his back and shoulders into the swing. He didn't see the patch of black ice beneath the snow where he stood. As he brought the heavy iron bar down his left boot, slipped. The momentum of the swing carried him forward. The 60-pound iron bar glanced off the edge of the frozen trough and slammed sideways into Gideon's right shin with the sickening sound of snapping bone and tearing flesh. Gideon didn't scream. The air rushed out of his lungs in a violent hiss. He collapsed backward into the snow, dropping the bar. Pain, white-hot and blinding, rocketed up his leg. He grabbed his shin, his thick canvas trousers already warm and wet. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the wave of nausea that threatened to empty his stomach. "Damn it!" He gasped, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He tried to stand. His right leg refused to hold weight, buckling instantly. He fell hard, his face slamming into the snowbank. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his chest. At 30 below zero, a man who couldn't walk was a dead man. He rolled onto his back, gritting his teeth, and looked toward the cabin. It was 50 yards away, through waist-deep snow. He began to drag himself. He dug his elbows into the powder, pulling his heavy body forward. His broken leg dragged behind him like an anchor, sending fresh spikes of agony through his nervous system with every inch. The snow soaked through his coat, chilling him to the bone. 10 yards. 20. His vision began to blur at the edges. The cold was a narcotic whispering at him to just stop, just rest for a minute, just close his eyes. The cabin door flew open. Clara stood on the porch, wrapped in her dark shawl. She saw the trench in the snow. She saw the massive man dragging himself through the drift, leaving a faint pink trail of diluted blood in his wake. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She leaped off the porch, plunging waist-deep into the freezing snow, and fought her way toward him. She moved like a demon, tearing through the drift until she reached him. "Gideon!" she yelled, dropping to her knees beside him. His face was terrifyingly pale, his lips blue. "Leg," he grunted, pointing a shaking, blood-stained glove at his right shin. Spud bar slipped. Clara didn't waste time asking how bad it was. She grabbed him by the lapels of his heavy coat. "You have to help me," she ordered, her voice cutting through the freezing air like a whip. "I cannot carry you. You have to push." She wrapped her arms around his chest, hauling backward. Gideon dug his good heel into the snow and pushed. Inch by agonizing inch they fought their way towards the porch. Clara's breath tore through her throat in ragged gasps. Her hands devoid of gloves turned red, and then a frightening waxy white as she hauled his dead weight up the wooden steps. She dragged him over the threshold and kicked the door shut behind them, sealing out the brutal cold. Gideon lay on the floorboards, shivering violently, his teeth chattering. Clara didn't give herself a second to rest. She ran to the stove, grabbing the sharp paring knife she used for vegetables. She dropped to her knees beside him and sliced brutally through the heavy canvas of his trouser leg, peeling the fabric back. Gideon hissed in pain. The damage was severe. A jagged, ugly gash ran down his shin. The bone hadn't broken the skin, but it was clearly fractured, the leg swelling rapidly purple and angry. Blood welled continuously from the deep laceration pooling on the clean floorboards. "It's bleeding too fast." Clara said, her voice tight but remarkably steady. She stood up, ran to the bed, and ripped one of the clean linen pillowcases to shreds. She rushed back, grabbed a bottle of raw whiskey from the larder shelf, and knelt beside him. "This is going to burn," she warned. "Do it," he ground out. She unstoppered the bottle and poured the alcohol directly into the open wound. Gideon's back arched off the floor. A low, guttural roar ripped from his throat, the sound echoing off the heavy log walls. He grabbed the leg of the oak table, his knuckles turning white, his muscles straining. Clara didn't flinch at his roar. She packed the wound tight with the torn linen pressing down with the entire weight of her upper body to staunch the blood flow. "I need to stitch it," she said, looking at his pale, sweating face. "If I don't close the flesh, you'll bleed out before the bone sets." "My sewing kit." Gideon panted, his chest heaving. "Top drawer of the chest." Clara ran to the chest, retrieving the thick bone needle and heavy waxed thread Gideon used for mending leather harnesses. She sterilized the needle in the fire, poured a splash of whiskey over her own freezing hands, and returned to him. "Hold still," she commanded. She drove the heavy needle through his skin. Gideon closed his eyes, locking his jaw so hard his teeth threatened to crack. He focused on the ceiling rafters. He focused on the sound of the fire. He focused on the woman saving his life. Clara worked with ruthless efficiency. Her hands were smeared with his blood, her knuckles raw and freezing, but they didn't shake. She pulled the thick thread tight, closing the jagged wound with 8 harsh, ugly, perfectly secure stitches. When she finished, she bound the leg tightly with strips of clean cloth. Only then did she sit back on her heels, wiping a strand of sweat-soaked hair from her forehead with a bloody wrist. She looked at him. He looked at her. The air in the cabin was thick with the metallic smell of blood and the sharp tang of whiskey. "You need splints," Clara said, her voice finally trembling. "And I need to get you into the bed." Gideon let out a long, shuddering breath. The pain was a living entity gnawing at his leg, but the bleeding had stopped. He looked at the blood on her hands, at her ruined dress, at the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. He had asked the agency to send someone who wasn't afraid of the dark. He hadn't realized they would send him someone who could fight it back. "Clara," he said softly, his voice raspy. She paused, looking down at him. "Thank you." It wasn't a transaction anymore. It wasn't an arrangement born of convenience or isolation. As she grabbed him by the shoulders and helped him drag his battered body toward the hearth, Gideon knew with absolute certainty that this woman belonged to the mountain just as much as he did. And for the first time in his long, solitary life, Gideon Reed was glad he wasn't alone. Setting the bone was a brutal, ugly piece of business. Gideon dragged himself onto the heavy oak bed, his vision swimming in a nauseating sea of grey. The whiskey had dulled the sharpest edges of the agony, but the deep, grinding ache in his marrow remained. Clara did not give him time to rest. She returned from the woodpile carrying 2 straight lengths of split pine. "The bone isn't straight," she said. Her voice was flat. It was the voice of a woman who had seen men die of gangrene in city tenements and knew what hesitation cost. Gideon looked down. Beneath the bloody bandages, his shin bowed at an unnatural angle. If it healed like that, he would be crippled. A man who couldn't walk the trap lines was a dead man. "You have to pull it!" Gideon rasped, his chest heaving. "Pull the heel, hard, straight out!" Clara didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She grabbed a thick leather belt from the peg on the wall and handed it to him. "Bite down." Gideon clamped the thick leather between his teeth. He gripped the heavy iron bed frame with both hands, his knuckles turning stark white. Clara stood at the foot of the bed. She wrapped her small, bruised hands around his heavy leather boot. She didn't count to 3. She didn't warn him. She simply braced her feet against the floorboards, threw her entire weight backward, and pulled. The sound of the bone grinding against itself was sickening, a wet, heavy crunch that echoed over the crackle of the fire. Gideon's vision went entirely black. A muffled primal roar tore through the leather belt. His muscles seized violently, throwing his body against the mattress. And then mercifully he passed out. When he drifted back to consciousness, the cabin was dark save for the low embers in the hearth. His leg was elevated on a folded quilt, bound tightly between the 2 pine splints. The throbbing was a constant heavy pulse matching his heartbeat, but the terrifying, jagged agony was gone. He turned his head. Clara was sitting in the wooden chair by the fire. She was asleep, her chin resting on her chest. Her hands lay palm up in her lap. They were covered in dried, blood-raw blisters and deep purple bruises. The transaction was over. Gideon knew it as he looked at her. He had paid for a woman to keep the house. He had not paid for a savior. You couldn't buy what she had just done. The next morning, the reality of their situation settled over the cabin like a suffocating blanket. Gideon could not walk. The mules needed to be fed. The wood needed to be chopped. The ice needed to be broken. The relentless machinery of survival had rested squarely on Gideon's massive shoulders, and now that entire weight transferred to Clara. She woke before dawn. She didn't ask him how to do the chores. She simply put on his heavy canvas coat, which swallowed her small frame entirely, wrapped a wool scarf around her face, and picked up the rifle. "I'll see to the animals," she said. "Clara," Gideon called out, his voice rough. "The broadaxe is too heavy for you. Use the hatchet to split the kindling. Just take what we need to keep the stove hot. Don't push yourself." She looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "I know how to work, Gideon." She stepped out into the crushing cold. The heavy door clicked shut behind her. Gideon lay in the bed, helpless. He listened. For the first time in his life, he was a passenger. He heard the muffled crunch of her boots in the deep snow. A few minutes later, he heard the sharp, ringing thwack of the hatchet biting into frozen wood. It was a jagged rhythm. Strike. Pause. Strike. It wasn't the smooth, powerful cadence he produced. It was the sound of a woman throwing her entire body weight behind every swing, fighting the wood for every single splinter. An hour later she returned. Her face was flushed dark red from the cold, her breath tearing through her lungs in ragged, exhausted gasps. She dumped an armful of split wood into the iron cradle, dropping the hatchet to the floorboards with a heavy clatter. She didn't complain. She walked to the stove, added wood to the fire, and began boiling water for coffee. Over the next week, Gideon watched her shrink. The physical toll of the high country was brutal. Clara hauled water from the creek, breaking the ice with a heavy iron skillet. She dragged hay to the mules. She chopped wood until her hands bled, wrapping her cracked palms in rags so she could keep swinging the axe. She grew thinner, the soft edges of her face hardening into sharp angles of sheer willpower. One evening, as the wind battered the cedar shake roof, Clara stood by the stove, stirring a pot of beans. Gideon watched her from the bed. She moved slowly, her shoulders hunched with exhaustion. She dropped the wooden spoon. It clattered to the floor. She didn't pick it up. She just stood there, staring at the cast-iron stove, her hands gripping the edge of the metal counter. Her shoulders began to shake. It was a silent, terrifying tremor. Gideon pushed himself up on his elbows. He ignored the screaming protest of his leg. "Clara!" She didn't turn around. "Come here," he commanded, his voice soft but unyielding. She stood frozen for a long moment. Then she turned. There were no tears on her face. Her eyes were dry, burning with a fierce, exhausted anger. She walked over to the bed and stopped beside him. Gideon reached out and took her hand. He slowly unwrapped the dirty, blood-stained rag from her palm. Beneath it the skin was raw, meat, blistered, and broken from the handle of the axe. He didn't offer pity. Pity was useless out here. "You're keeping us alive," Gideon said, looking directly into her eyes. "I see it. I see every piece of wood you cut. I see every bucket you haul." "I am so tired," Clara whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the confession. "I am so incredibly tired." "I know," Gideon said. He pulled her hand to his chest, resting her ruined palm against his rough flannel shirt right over his heart. "You can rest. Let the fire burn down tonight. We have enough blankets. Let the mules wait until mid-morning. You sit down, Clara. You stop moving." She looked at him, and the rigid, unbending spine that had kept her upright for years finally gave way. She sat on the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands, leaning heavily against his solid shoulder. Gideon wrapped his thick arm around her back. He held her. He didn't speak. He just let his presence be the wall she could lean against when she had nothing left to give. The infection came on the 10th day. Gideon woke in the middle of the night, his teeth chattering so violently he feared they would crack. The cabin was sweltering. Clara had built the fire up to a roar, but Gideon felt as though he were buried naked in a snowdrift. A deep, unnatural cold radiated from his bones outward. Clara bolted upright from her pallet on the floor. She took one look at his flushed, sweating face and moved. She threw the quilts off his leg and unwrapped the bindings. The flesh around the stitches was angry, swollen tight and shining with heat. Ugly red streaks spiderwebbed up his calf, pointing like bloody arrows toward his knee. "The wound is soured," Clara said, her voice tight with fear. Gideon gripped the edges of the mattress. "Cut the stitches. It'll bleed. If you don't let the poison out, it'll take the leg." Gideon ground out sweat pouring down his temples, matting his thick hair. "Cut them." Clara grabbed her small paring knife. She held the blade over the chimney of the kerosene lantern until the steel blackened. She didn't hesitate. She sliced through the heavy waxed thread, pulling the stitches out with a pair of iron tweezers. Thick, foul-smelling pus immediately welled from the angry gash, mixed with dark blood. The smell of rotting meat hit the air. Clara washed the wound aggressively with boiling water and coarse salt. Gideon thrashed a guttural groan escaping his chest as the raw salt bit deep into his torn flesh. She packed the open wound with clean linen, binding it tight, then turned her attention to the man. By morning the chill had passed, replaced by a raging, consuming fire. Gideon's mind detached from the room. He was no longer in the cabin. He was back in the mud of Antietam. He heard the artillery shells screaming overhead. He smelled the black powder and the copper stench of torn bodies. He thrashed wildly against the bed frame, shouting orders to men who had been dead for a decade. "Hold the line!" Gideon roared, his massive fist striking the wooden wall. "Don't let them flank the ridge." Clara fought him. She threw her entire body weight across his chest, pinning him to the mattress so he wouldn't shatter his splintered leg. He was twice her size, driven by the terrifying strength of delirium, but she clung to him like a burr, her knuckles white. "Gideon, stop!" she yelled, her face inches from his. "You are in the cabin. Look at me." His pale grey eyes stared right through her, wide and unseeing. For 3 days the battle raged. The blizzard had returned outside, burying the cabin in a howling white darkness, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside the walls. Clara barely slept. She stopped chopping wood for the stove, focusing entirely on keeping the hearth fire burning. She filled tin basins with snow, bringing them inside to melt slightly before plunging rags into the freezing slush. She packed the icy rags around Gideon's neck under his arms and over his chest, trying to draw the boiling heat from his blood. He spoke constantly. Stripped of his quiet, guarded exterior, the fever pulled his deepest, darkest thoughts to the surface. "It's too quiet!" He mumbled, his head tossing back and forth on the sweat-soaked pillow. "Can't hear them breathing. They're all gone. Just the snow left." Clara sat beside him, bathing his forehead with a freezing rag. "I'm here," she said firmly. "I am breathing. Listen to me." "Don't go!" Gideon whispered, suddenly gripping her wrist with terrifying strength. His eyes locked onto hers, briefly lucid, swimming with a terror she had never seen in him. "Don't walk out into the snow. It takes everything." "I am not going anywhere," Clara said. She pressed her other hand over his hot knuckles. "I told you, I don't mind the dark." On the 3rd night, Clara ran out of strength. The larder was empty of fresh meat. The woodpile was dangerously low. Her hands were wrapped in filthy, blood-stained rags. She sat on the floor beside the bed, staring blankly at the flickering fire. The relentless howl of the wind outside sounded like a physical threat. Gideon was still. His breathing was shallow and fast. The fever had burned through his fat and muscle, leaving his face hollow and gaunt beneath his thick beard. Clara rested her head against the edge of the mattress. "You do not get to die," she whispered into the quiet room. Her voice was utterly devoid of the stoicism she usually carried. It was raw, cracked, and desperate. "You do not get to bring me out here, build me a house, and leave me in it alone. I scrubbed floors for 5 years. I starved. I froze. I didn't survive all of that just to bury you in the snow." She stood up, grabbed the heavy iron bucket, and opened the front door. The wind screamed, blasting a layer of snow across the floorboards. Clara marched out into the freezing night. She dug through the snowdrift with her bare, raw hands until she found the frozen roots of the willow trees growing by the creek bank. She hacked at them with the hatchet, crying in pure frustration and exhaustion as the dull blade bounced off the frozen earth. She tore a handful of roots free, carried them inside, and boiled them aggressively in the tin pot until the water turned a dark, muddy brown. She lifted Gideon's heavy head, forcing the bitter willowbark tea past his cracked lips. He choked, swallowing reflexively. She sat beside him, holding his hand, and waited for the dawn. Just before the sun crested the ridge, Gideon's hand twitched. Clara snapped awake. She felt his skin. It was slick with sweat soaking through the sheets, but the terrifying, radiating heat was gone. His skin was cool. Gideon slowly opened his eyes. The delirium had vanished, leaving his pale grey eyes clear, exhausted, and remarkably lucid. He looked at the log ceiling. He looked at the dying fire. Then he looked at Clara. She looked like a ghost. Her hair had escaped its tight bun, hanging in tangled, greasy strands around her pale, hollow face. Her dress was stained with blood soot and sweat. She looked older, harder, and entirely broken. Gideon swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. "You stayed," he whispered. Clara let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. She slumped forward, resting her forehead against his massive chest. "Where else would I go?" she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "It's my house." The icicles on the eaves finally broke. They shattered against the porch boards with the sharp sound of snapping glass. The deep freeze was losing its grip. 6 weeks had passed since the fever broke. The snow in the clearing was receding, exposing the muddy, crushed yellow grass of the alpine spring. The creek, frozen solid for months, was running again. The steady rushing sound filled the valley, chasing away the deadly silence of winter. Inside the cabin, the suffocating weight of sheer survival had lifted. Gideon stood by the hearth. He wasn't a whole man yet, but he was upright. He leaned heavily on a thick crutch carved from a hickory branch. His right leg was weak, the muscle atrophied beneath his canvas trousers, but the bone had knit cleanly. He could stand. He watched Clara. She stood at the heavy oak table, aggressively kneading a mound of bread dough. She punched the dough, folded it, and drove the heels of her hands into it with a steady, rhythmic violence. The winter had fundamentally changed her. She had arrived as a woman accustomed to making herself small, navigating the narrow, cruel margins of city tenements. The mountain had stripped that away. She wore his old flannel shirts now tucked into her faded skirts. Her shoulders were broader. The calluses on her hands were thick as saddle leather. She moved with the undeniable authority of a woman who owned the ground she stood on. She looked up, catching him watching her. She didn't blush or look away. She simply wiped a streak of flour from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "The larder is bare," Clara said, turning the dough over. "We are down to flour salt and half a sack of dried beans. I can walk to the lower ridge tomorrow," Gideon said, shifting his grip on the crutch. "The elk will be moving up from the valley to graze the new shoots. I can drop one." Clara stopped kneading. She looked at his leg, then met his gaze dead on. "If you drop a 600-pound elk in the valley, how do you intend to carry the meat back up the ridge with a piece of hickory under your arm?" Gideon scowled, his pride bristling. "I'll quarter it. Drag it on a travois. I'm not an invalid." "No, you are a stubborn fool," Clara said flatly. She slapped the dough into a cast-iron pan and covered it with a damp cloth. She walked around the table and stopped directly in front of him. "I will take the rifle. I will go to the lower ridge. You will sit on that porch and wait for me to bring the meat." Gideon stared down at her. He felt a flash of irritation quickly swallowed by a profound, overwhelming wave of respect. He had spent his life relying entirely on himself. Giving up that control went against every instinct in his bones. But he looked at the woman standing before him. He remembered the blinding pain, the fever, the smell of rotting flesh, and the absolute, unyielding grip of her hands holding him back from the grave. He didn't need to be the only wall holding the roof up anymore. "You aim high," Gideon said softly. "Elk have thick chests. Put the sight right behind the front shoulder midway up. Don't jerk the trigger. Squeeze it." Clara's lips twitched in a faint, rare smile. "I know how to shoot, Gideon. I spent the last month watching you clean that rifle." She reached out, intending to adjust the collar of his flannel shirt. It was a purely domestic gesture. But as her rough, scarred fingers brushed against the thick beard on his jaw, Gideon moved. He dropped the crutch. It hit the floorboards with a heavy clatter. He put his full weight on his bad leg, ignoring the sharp twinge of pain, and wrapped his massive arms around her waist. He pulled her flush against his chest. Clara gasped, her hands flattening against his shoulders. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide in the sudden quiet of the cabin. "The arrangement is void," Gideon rumbled. "Void?" Clara repeated breathlessly. "I wrote a letter asking for a woman to share the work," Gideon said, his pale, grey eyes fixed intensely on hers. "I offered meat and a fire, a transaction." He brought his large, rough hand up, tangling his fingers in the hair at the nape of her neck. "I don't want an arrangement anymore, Clara. I want my wife." For the first time since she stepped off the stagecoach in Bitter Creek, her severe, hardened mask shattered. Her eyes filled with tears, not of exhaustion, but of an overwhelming, crushing relief. She didn't need to fight for her place anymore. She grabbed the lapels of his shirt, pulled him down, and kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't polite. It was a fierce clash of teeth and breath. It tasted like coffee flour and raw survival. It was the kiss of two hardened people who had fought death in the freezing dark and won the right to stand in the light. Hours later, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light across the clearing. Gideon sat in a heavy wooden chair on the front porch, his legs stretched out before him. Clara sat beside him, wrapped in her dark shawl, a steaming tin mug of coffee in her hands. They didn't speak. There was no need. They watched the snowmelt run off the cedar shakes. Gideon reached out, taking Clara's calloused hand in his massive grip. He rubbed his thumb over the hard ridges of her knuckles. He had pulled the timber from the mountain. He had stacked the stones and driven the iron nails. But as Clara squeezed his hand, leaning her head against his shoulder, Gideon knew the truth. He built the house. She called it home. The harsh frontier demands everything, but for Gideon and Clara, the bitter winter yielded a bond stronger than iron. Their story proves that true romance isn't found in flowery promises, but in shared burdens, calloused hands, and a fire kept burning through the darkest nights. If this grounded, deeply human tale of survival and earned love resonated with you, please hit that like button and share this video with fellow fans of authentic Western dramas. Subscribe to the channel to ensure you never miss our next rugged adventure. Thank you for listening, and keep the fire burning.